No, the 19th century, everybody wanted to find laws of physics, laws of chemistry. And so Tylor thought he had the laws on religious evolution. Andrew Lang said, that's not possible to maintain. There are these two options, either animism as a start or monotheism as a start for religions. And he preferred monotheism. There are ways in which we can tell which culture was earlier, which was later, and so forth. And, India is a marvelous example. In fact, I've used Hyderabad specifically as an example. Nobody today who wants to have any kind of standing in the anthropological community would subscribe to mandatory phases of religion like Tylor did and some of his followers. But they assume that religion began with something primitive and then somehow, not necessarily by standard stages, but in some way then degenerated into some other form of religion.
Hi there, welcome to the Carpenter's Desk. Today I'm joined with the American philosopher of religion, Dr. Winfried Corduan. He holds a PhD from Rice University and is a professor emeritus of philosophy and religion at Taylor University, Upland, Indiana. He has led many undergraduate tours focusing on the lived religious traditions of various parts of the world. He is the author of several books, including Handmaid to Theology, Reasonable Faith, Basic Christian Apologetics, Neighboring Faiths, A Tapestry of Faiths, Mysticism and Evangelical Option, Philosophy of Religion, which was co-authored with the late Norman Geisler, and the one that our conversation today will be based on, which is In the Beginning God, a fresh look at the case for original monotheism. Welcome, Dr. Corduan, to the Carpenter's Desk.
Thank you, Asher. It's a privilege and a pleasure to be here with you today.
Thank you, Dr. Corduan. Really looking forward to this conversation because, I was just saying before we started recording that this book, probably, when I actually started reading this, I was not really aware that this is such a deep and profound topic. And I was really caught off guard because I actually, the first thing that I watched was a video by Inspiring Philosophy, which was on this topic. And that's when I thought, okay, this is an interesting topic. But I must say that when I actually, Dr. Corduan's book was one of the references used. And that's how I was led to read your book. And when I started reading, I found that it's much beyond the video. It's more, it's intense and interesting a topic that deserves to be, it has much more apologetic utility than I actually thought first, when I heard of that topic. And I must say that I was really blessed by the work, Dr. Corduan.
Well, thank you, Asher. I try to make it as accessible as possible, but there are some discussions going on that require a little bit of scholarly background to really make the case stick.
Right. And that's exactly what Dr. Corduan does. He goes through some of the most prominent scholarly views on the topic first, throughout history. And then he actually goes on defending his hypothesis. There's a lot of diagrams and, the culture historical method, all of that, which we will discuss today. And you guys will definitely stick around. You will definitely enjoy this conversation. And while you're at it, you can also check out this playlist called Conversations at the Desk, where we regularly feature scholars and apologists from around the world to talk topics like these. And stay subscribed for more. So let's get started, Dr. Corduan.
Okay.
As we go along, as we address different views and different, subtopics. Before we just do that, what really got you interested in this topic? And as I said, this is not a widely discussed topic in apologetics. What really got you interested? And then probably you can go and just give a brief summary of your case for original monotheism.
Okay, thank you. Yes. What got me interested in it goes back a long, long time. When I was a child in Germany, I was in the high school called Gymnasium, and we had regularly scheduled religion instruction in the public school. I, as a Protestant, was with a Protestant teacher, and then the Catholics went with the priest. One day, the Protestant teacher wasn't available, so the priest talked to the whole class. And I'm here to tell you he had a lot more substance to his teaching than the liberal Protestant teacher. And somehow he came on the topic of there being a basic knowledge of God among various people. And he told us about various tribal groups that if you were to visit them, they wouldn't tell you about their religion. They would keep it a secret because it was too important to them. So they wouldn't have gotten it from a missionary or a white person because they were suspicious of them. But if you really got to know and trust them, then they would let you in on their mystery. Namely, here we go, there is actually only one God. And this is the one whom we actually worship. And I was sitting there as a little Baptist thinking, wow, I'd never heard this. And I didn't hear about it then for a long time to come, but I was really intrigued by that. And then later on, when God called me to read on various books on religion, I came across this idea over and over again as something that, oh, this Catholic priest, Wilhelm Schmidt, who was a professor in Vienna, an anthropologist in the 1920s through the 1950s, that he had actually put forward the thesis of original monotheism. And of course, that statement then was followed immediately with, but he was a Catholic priest, and so most people don't take him seriously, or something along that line. Well, there's only one thing to do in that case. If you're really interested in it, you go back and read what Schmidt has actually written. And I discovered that he made a very strong case for the idea, okay, this is the hypothesis then, that the first religion of human beings was belief in one God who exceeds us in power and knowledge and goodness, who created the world and who wants us to live by certain ethical standards. And so that's the basic theory. Now, if you want me to go on, the question becomes, how can you prove that? And I must say right now that, the picture of God in those tribes is not the biblical picture. I mean, they've been around for thousands of years, and a lot of times they have certain attributes that don't make sense to us necessarily. But he does have the attributes that I just mentioned,
right?
Creator, all powerful, and so forth. Now, there was a person named Andrew Lang, a scholar, Scottish scholar, and he did a lot of, it did a lot of research reading anthropologists' report, and he came to the conclusion that apparently religion may have had two kinds of origins. Some developed out of spirit worship, and some started out with a monotheism. Now, Andrew Lang could not decide between the two of them, which may have been first, if either
Right.
one. And that's where Wilhelm Schmidt came in with his method, which we can talk about
Right.
later if you like, and showed that it is possible to establish a chronological sequence of so-called primitive religions, as he would call them. And I know the word primitive isn't exactly a good word these days, but that was the word he used. And that is the very oldest cultures, the ones that seem to be least developed,
Right.
are the ones who hold to a rather pure monotheism.
Right. Right. So I think you've already discussed in brief Lang and Schmidt, but in the book you also go through Max Muller's view, how probably he argued that basically religion could be something that evolved from language, and some other views as well. So would you just like to go through that through those scholarly views, probably a quick review, so that our audience are up to probably get a gist of it. And one more thing that I'll just, you already mentioned about that biblical view of God. There is no biblical presupposition in what Dr. Corduan is presenting. That's a conversation, that's a discussion that we'll probably reserve for later. But before that, the scholarly views, Dr. Corduan, and what are the different models that have been put forward to
Right.
explain the development of religion?
Yeah. Okay. Now, we don't need to discuss the biblical passages, but the fact is that until the early 19th century or so, or maybe even later, scholars just assumed a biblical idea
Right.
that God created the world and he is the God whom we worship, and that other religions somehow degenerated from that. But that was kind of an assumption. It was not necessarily a scholarly thesis that anyone thought that they needed to prove. Then it began with David Hume, the philosopher,
Right.
who said that really religion began with the worship of spirits, animism, and that everything else has just been added by people. And of course, he didn't believe in any religious facts at all. He thought it was all false. And that idea was then hanging in the air. And then mid 19th century, with the coming of some strong ideologies like Marxism and other forms of atheism and so forth, and then Charles Darwin and his publications on evolution, scholars began to think in terms of an evolution of religion. Now, let me briefly mention a couple. Okay, you made reference to Max Muller, who whose point is not particularly convincing in that area. He was a philologist, that's a linguist who also takes culture into account. And he thought that religious myths simply arose out of a misunderstanding of poetic language. And now Andrew Lang at the time was a strong disciple of another person called E.B.Tylor.
Right.
Now, E.B.Tylor was, with all no intent to speak sarcastically of Catholics, he was the Pope of the evolution of religion. What he said was considered ex cathedra. And now he was a scholar. He never finished his degree, but he did a lot of research on a lot of different cultures. And then he established his scheme and said all over the world, what we see is an evolution of religion that begins with, quote, animism, the belief that there are spirits all over. There are nature spirits, human spirits, evil spirits, and so forth. And from there, evolution of religion progressed to polytheism, that those spirits were seen with more and more power and so forth, and some of them became acknowledged as gods. Then, in some cultures, the polytheism turned into what is called a henotheism, which means that there is one God who stands out above all the others, and he is the main God, but the others are also gods. And then the next step would be monotheism, which says there is only one God who should be worshipped. So Tylor's point was that even Christian monotheism is just an inflated version of animism. You take a spirit and think of it as a balloon, and the more air you pump into it, the greater it becomes until you have a big, huge balloon, and that's a god then. That's the god of monotheism. So Tylor was very respected and acknowledged, and his thought became the pattern for quite a while. Now, I mentioned Andrew Lang was a big disciple of his,
right?
And he totally undermined Max Muller in many ways. And then as Andrew Lang began to study the same data that Tylor was studying, he all of a sudden realized that there was no way that you could just find that pattern. Now, the 19th century, everybody wanted to find laws of physics, laws of chemistry. And so Tylor thought he had the laws on religious evolution. Andrew Lang said, that's not possible to maintain. There are these two options, either animism as a start or monotheism as a start for religions. And he preferred monotheism, but couldn't decide which was the correct one. And then Wilhelm Schmidt came along with his theory and put holes into Tylor's belief system, his system of evolution. At the same time, there were some other scholars, who'd never set foot in any of the regions talked about, and who didn't take many of the reports seriously, and who just made up a creative way in which religion must have started. For example, just one more example, Sir J.G. Fraser, who said that no, religion did not begin with animism, but there's a pre-animistic stage in which magic is the beginning point. Magic means that there's an impersonal force in the universe, and people initially just tried to see if they could magically control their lives and the world around them. And then when they could not, then they started to believe in personal spirits, and then he pretty much follows Tylor's system.
Okay, that's I mean, you have kind of quickly reviewed through these different scholarly views that have developed on the topic. But now that we get to the case for original monotheism, right? The big challenge that anyone would have is, how do you actually reconstruct that? I mean, you have to go back in time and you have to reconstruct the beliefs of the what you can call the primitive cultures. So what is the methodology involved here, Dr. Corduan?
Okay, you build yourself a time machine and you said, okay, no, you read what people wrote 10,000 years ago. No, that doesn't work either. But these are things that people say, well, that's the only way we could verify it.
Right.
Now, one other thing that does not really work, and that was what Andrew Lang got hung up on. You can make a list of all the so-called, okay, I'll call it something else than primitive. I mean, at the time, that was a technical expression. Now it's just a little bit pejorative. So let's say some of the least materially developed cultures, and you can make yourself a list of them and check which one has a monotheism, which one has an animism. And then you could decide on a majority vote, I guess, which is the earliest one. And that doesn't work either, because there's just, it's not a statistical thing.
Right.
So you have to figure out a way in which you can actually be able to tell which may reflect the earliest human culture. And so what Schmidt did was to use a method that had been used by others before who did not share his view. Okay, he did not develop this method specifically in order to defend original monotheism, but the method was started by Fritz Graebner, who said there are ways in which we can tell which culture was earlier, which was later, and so forth. And, India is a marvelous example. In fact, I've used Hyderabad specifically as an example because you have, first of all, the Northwest Indian culture, the Harappa culture, and we know that they were earlier than others because the people are gone, we can't read their language and so forth. We have the Aryan religion, who, according to Western scholarship at least, came down to India. And I know that many Indians believe it was the original religion and so forth. I don't share that view, but that's a different issue altogether. Right. And we have the Dravidic religion in Tamil Nadu and so forth. And they met. And then we can see, it's like Hyderabad is so perfect because you have the northern religion of Hinduism, which has overtaken kind of the northern edge of the Tamil religion.
Right.
So a good example would be son of Vishnu, who became Subramanian in southern India, and it's very obvious that the original Hinduism took over.
Great.
And you have Islam there. Right. Of course, Hyderabad turned into an Islamic kingdom with the Kut dynasty, and you can tell these layers of development. Now, you can also do that with the pre-literate cultures. You can tell, if you have a culture that has a simple design of pottery, and then there are other cultures that have the same design, but have things added to it, and different cultures added different things, then, and I'm really simplifying this, but then the culture that has not added anything was probably the oldest one.
Correct.
And, we can go on from there. If you have a myth, a basic story, and different cultures change it, but in all other respects agree with a simple story, then I apologize for the simplicity, but then you can infer that the culture with the unadorned myth was probably the earlier one. You can assume that tattoos, that the original human beings didn't tattoo themselves. And so that, this is just one small example again, but chances are that a culture with a lot of tattoos on their skin is probably less reflective of the earlier cultures of human beings where they didn't have tattoos and so forth. So it's a matter of establishing a sequence and seeing how these cultures are related.
Okay.
And then there are certain, we can call them families of cultures or culture circles. I don't think that any people group just decided that they would live in the desert with little water available, few natural resources, eating lizards and some plants that they find and so forth. I don't think they would have gone there by choice if they had not been displaced by a culture with a higher level of material development. And so you wind up seeing that some of the cultures in the Aboriginal cultures in Australia, some of the Eskimo cultures, some of the Bushman cultures, particularly Pygmoids and Pygmy ones and so forth, are some of the least developed, and lo and behold, they are the ones who actually hold to a monotheism where they worship only God and try to follow what they see as God's ethical requirements of them. Do not steal, do not commit adultery, and so forth.
Right. So, yeah, so you've actually described that pretty well. So you have these different cultures that you said, in Australia and different parts of the world, and these cultures are actually geographically separated from each other, but you're saying that they still have a core set of beliefs. Is that what you're saying?
A basic belief, yeah, in the one God.
Okay.
And yeah, they're separated from each other. And obviously, Aboriginal Australians couldn't survive at the North Pole or in Greenland, whereas Eskimos couldn't survive in the Australian desert. So there are a lot of cultural differences, but you do find a similarity in the belief of the one God, in the rules associated with him, and in many cases, in many cultures. Now we're going way beyond them. There is the belief that once upon a time there was a creator, but he left. And so there's a memory of him, but he's no longer being worshipped or worshipped only on special occasions. On the other hand, the least developed cultures do also worship God, though they realize that they have been alienated from God in some way.
Sure, I can already see how that is emerging perfectly, right? So, so these are some of the characteristics. I mean, if you want to discuss more on the characteristics of the supreme being in which they believe, so that we can actually draw that line from the data to the hypothesis, right? What are those characteristics that are pretty much largely common between these cultures, and how well does that fit with the God of the Bible that we see?
Okay, I have to approach this the same way that I would approach, say, Allah in Islam and other monotheistic religions these days. The basic attributes of this God are, first of all, that he is not an exalted human. Okay, he's not developed from the picture of a tribal patriarch or a famous chief or something like that. because in these cultures, there is no patriarch, there is no chief. Things are done by consensus of the community. Basically, there are elders, but there's no single powerful chief. Okay, he's not just an anthropomorphic version of the people. He does have greater power than any human being, as can be seen in his being the creator of the world. He has certain expectations of human beings. He wants us to live according to the rules of the tribe, which are basically similar to a natural ethics or the Ten Commandments and so forth, the basic prohibitions against adultery, against stealing, against murder, against lying, that kind of a thing. There may be some other cultural ones. And he is expecting us to live by his standards. And in many cultures where they don't even pay much attention to him, if something goes wrong, like there's an epidemic or something, and all of a sudden, oh yeah, let's consult the big God, and we've probably offended him. And so for a short while, they pray to him, and then then they leave him alone again. Now, so as you can see, there's a lot of similarity in the fundamental attributes of God, which dovetails with the God of the Bible. But then there are specific characteristics that have been added throughout the life of the culture. For example, the high God in some of the Australian religions has the feet of an emu. When they picture him, we tend to picture God as a wise guru sitting in his chair or so, which is just as much an image imposed on him, and they picture him in anthropomorphic or theomorphic fashion, like an animal. So I cannot pray to the God of that Australian tribe, even though it is a monotheism that's very evidently derived from the original monotheism, which is the same thing for so-called, quote, higher religions, more developed religions. I cannot pray to Allah, because even though we have the same source for belief in God, Allah has attributes that Yahweh does not have, the God of the Bible. I can't pray to Ahura Mazda, the God of Parsiism, and so forth. We can go on with that. I mean, it is a God, the only God, and he shares those fundamental characteristics, but we can't take away from, can't just ignore the cultural differences either. But we see lines of development.
Yeah, so I mean, those are different monotheistic religions also that you have compared, but there are also other forms of religion. So, I mean, yeah, once you get to that basic monotheism, you can understand how monotheism itself got, you can see that divergence between monotheistic religions. But what about these very polytheistic or animistic religions? How do we explain their origins?
I mentioned before the idea that religion started with magic, trying to manipulate the forces, and that doesn't wash out at all.
Right.
But why did people come up with that to begin with? even though it's wrong? Well, because it would be such a handy thing to have. Now, uh, we know that God is all powerful, all loving, all good, and all knowing. And say my mother gets sick and I pray and pray, but she doesn't get any better.
Right.
And then someone comes along and says, well, you're not doing it the right way. You need to pray in such and such a way.
Mm-hmm.
Here is the prayer that everybody should pray, and then God will bless you.
Mm-hmm.
And from there you go to increasing ritual. And if you don't observe the ritual,
Mm-hmm.
then you're not in touch with the spiritual world.
Correct.
And then it becomes much easier to say, if you sacrifice some, say, barley or an animal, or in some African cultures, a pot of beer to the spirits, and you will, of course, pay me what I'm worth, then things will change. And, as human beings, we're always looking for the quick and easy solution. And when we're faced with a situation that's beyond our ability and God does not give us what we want, then it is very easy to just go to some kind of subordinate spiritual being. And then a culture develops around him and or it or them, and then it becomes established as a part of the culture.
Right. Yeah. So that makes pretty sense. So I mean, from these rituals, right? From these rituals, eventually religions take shape, and from these religions, probably different, even polytheistic forms, right? They are also, in a way, are emerging out of this.
Yes, yeah, it becomes a matter of proliferation. You have the one God, the creator, and he doesn't do anything. And we really can't do anything for him either. I mean, uh, in the Old Testament, God required sacrifices, but they were not magic. It
Correct.
was just a matter of expressing, our gratitude to God, repentance, and so forth. So he's looked on as unavailable. Whereas, okay, if you have a sick relative, then maybe
That's
that was
fine.
patty cake.
Patty.
Uh, if you if maybe you just prayed to the god or goddess who is in charge of health,
Mhm.
that'll be so much better. Or maybe it's not the god, but your personal spiritual balance is out of line, and so you need to get in contact with the spirits, and there'll be a shaman there to help you, or a priest to help you do that. And you get to the point where the ritual is really much more important than the deity.
Correct.
I mean, uh, if I may use another example, in India, you have a special need and you go to the temple and you pay your fee and you bring your offering, whatever it is, flower, coconut, or whatever, and you give it to the priest in charge of the deity. And then you stand there looking while he recites something in Vedic, which you don't even understand. One step even harder than Sanskrit. And he recites some passage, and you don't even know what he's doing. He may not even know what he's doing. He's memorized it, and he's memorized the ritual,
Mm-hmm.
and it's the ritual really that counts. But bottom line, I don't have to believe anything. The priest doesn't have to believe everything necessarily. The ritual takes the point of attention, and then if you ascribe it to various gods in a polytheistic setting, or various spirits, evil spirits, planets, whatever, it's going to be a deviation from the original belief in one God.
Mhm, mhm. Right. Yeah. So that pretty much, I think, answers it. And uh, on the other side, right? On the other side, when you actually comment on these naturalistic scholars who come in with a presupposition, right? Once you presuppose the uh, evolution through natural selection, and there is no supernatural, and then if you come with that presupposition, what are these scholars or what are these views unable to account for? What are the facts that they cannot account for? I think you have already discussed some facts, but specifically, connecting to their theories.
Okay, let me let me answer in two parts and leave the big gun for the second part. First of all, they cannot account for their own theory in terms of there being an actual sequence of development.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I said in the 19th century, every discipline and scholarship wanted to find laws,
Right.
laws of linguistics and so forth, and they wanted to find laws of development. And if you look at any single culture, you just don't see the development from spirits through gods, through a monotheism.
Mm-hmm.
You see the reverse. You see that there's the memory of one God, and then all of a sudden it falls into animism or polytheism. So one thing they cannot account for is that they cannot find the sequence.
Right.
They cannot support their own position empirically. Second, then, and this is really the biggie, they cannot account for the fact that you find a clear monotheism in these lesser developed cultures. Now, I mentioned E.B.Tylor before,
Mm-hmm.
and there are two times at which he changed his mind. Okay, you have the monotheistic cultures in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
And people were saying, some other scholars were saying that they must have gotten the monotheism from missionaries. Now, I mentioned earlier on that, as a matter of fact, they won't even tell you about their deity until you've really become familiar with them. And that certainly counts against the missionary cultures. And E.B.Tylor said, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
We have here a culture that has a monotheism that could not have been derived from missionaries.
Correct.
It must have evolved out of animism. But then Lang came along and showed that the monotheism could not have been derived from animism. And so in the second edition of Tylor's Anthropology, he said they must have developed their religion or received it from missionaries.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with American Indian, Native Americans in the US. You have the Algonquin tribes, for example, who were monotheistic. And people were saying that, oh, they must have gotten that from missionaries. Well, physically impossible. And again, there's just no sign of any influence and so forth. So Tylor wrote in the first edition of his Primitive Religion, that's the name of the book, that they could not have derived it from missionaries. It must have evolved. Again, it was shown that there could be no evolution. And so in a second edition, he said they must have received it from missionaries. So to me, that is one of the strongest Achilles heels certainly in Tylor and in any number of other big names in the evolution of religion, is that you just cannot account for it, for these monotheistic cultures, either by way of postulating an evolution, nor by contact with missionaries.
Correct.
So,
Right.
And let me mention one point, by the way, while I'm still using the word evolution. Nobody today who wants to have any kind of standing in the anthropological community would subscribe to mandatory phases of religion like Tylor did and some of his followers. But they assume that religion began with something primitive and then somehow, not necessarily by standard stages, but in some way then degenerated into some other form of religion. So the scheme itself is not accepted any longer, but the spirit behind it certainly still is.
Right. Now, probably as we come to a close, one question or one confusion that someone can have, and I think probably along the conversation you also discussed how again calling them the primitive men or the prehistoric man, right? They had a good moral sense, right? They had, right? But also that is one part. And this also, I mean, there could also be an objection that monotheism is quite complex, right? And could the prehistoric man have conceived or understood such a very sophisticated view as monotheism? I mean, if an objection comes like that, how would you respond?
Oh, yeah, and that's a really good point. Now, look at animism and polytheism and see how complex they are. Think of the Hindu pantheon with all the gods and their Shaktis and their offspring and so forth. Yeah, enough said on that. Think of animistic, spiritist religion and how complex it becomes. All the specific rituals that you're required to go through, and it needs a shaman or a priest or whatever. Now, think of yourself, and it doesn't have to be you. A child of 4 or 5 looks at a picture or of, say, a beautiful area in the world, or you're looking at something, or maybe a planetary model. And the easiest question to ask is, how did it come about? Who made it? And that's not complicated at all. Who made it? Well, it could not have just been there, but something must have made it, and it must have been something who was good and loving. And so a person, someone who is capable of doing these things, so he is more powerful than other human beings, who's more knowledgeable, and then if there is such a being, we need to respect him, we need to venerate him, we need to worship him because he is so great. And that really doesn't require a lot of complex thinking. I mean, the easiest question in the world is, who made it?
Right.
And how did it come about that we have this beautiful land or this complex universe or whatever.
Correct. Yeah, so I mean, once you actually mentioned the Hindu pantheon, I mean, I think if you just think about something like, or a worldview like Hinduism, with all of its richness, but it's still very complex. I mean, compared to monotheism, which is the most simplest deduction there, right?
Right, yeah, I think so. I mean, for one thing, monotheism does not require ritual.
Right.
And I don't know if you're familiar with the Taipusam festival in Tamil Nadu, and they practice it in Singapore as well, and in Malaysia, which is in honor of Subramanian.
Mm-hmm.
And the first day, the statue of Subramanian is moved to the Ganesha temple, and there are rituals associated with that. And then the next day they go through the piercings and carrying the kavadi and so forth. And then they go to the temple of Subramanian. And so, it's such a complexity.
Correct.
And of course, versions of Christianity, quote, wind up doing the same thing because it's so easy to fall into ritual and mistake that for religion. So I'm not saying that Christendom stands unscolded. There are a lot of falsehoods and in some cases departures from monotheism that you find among people who call themselves Christians.
Correct.
I lost my cell phone, and a lady told me she would pray to Saint Stephen that I would find it.
Right.
Other people told me, oh, I'll pray to God that you'll find it. And, I found it. And she said, see, I was right in praying to Saint Stephen. Now, Catholic Christians will say they don't worship the saints. They only venerate them. And for theoretical purposes, I'm happy to accept that distinction, but in the practical lives of people, it comes down to virtually a polytheism among certain groups. Okay, I don't want to do massive indictment of Catholic Christianity or anyone else, but and you also have, if not a monotheism, then a theism in Hinduism, since I brought that up.
Correct.
The ISKCON, the quote Hare Krishna people believe that the only God is Krishna. Now, there's multiple problems with that from a Christian perspective, but not everybody is guilty in terms of having forsaken God for the sake of pure animism and polytheism, but that is what has happened in a lot of cases.
Correct. Yeah. So I think that pretty much answers it well. And you just mentioned one ritual from Tamil Nadu, but if you just think about the thousands of rituals all around this vast country, I mean, it gets more complex and complex. And you can already see how, from that simple monotheism of the tribes that you mentioned, things got complex to an extent that what we see today. That perfectly makes sense. Yeah. So, right. Is there something else you wanted to add?
Can I put in a plug for my book, Neighboring Faiths?
Sure.
And as well as the In the Beginning God. But Neighboring Faiths is my survey of world religions and some of the things that I've alluded to here.
We'll also display that book on the screen. You can see it here. It's Neighboring Faiths, a book that you should, if you want to get a quick survey and a quick understanding, especially we're living in a very multicultural society of different worldviews, especially if you are into apologetics, this is a book that you should have on your shelf. It's called Neighboring Faiths. And Dr. Corduan, any final words, like how this information, I mean, we have discussed a lot of things, how this information can be used by Christians when they are talking to people, how they can package it and, use it for Christianity.
The Bible is right. The Bible says, in the beginning, God created. Okay, and he created human beings, and they recognized him, and they recognized that he had certain rules for them. And the work by Schmidt and others gives a scholarly, rational confirmation for what we accept as faith, on faith. And the motivation behind the other theories, we have to say, is to try to undercut the biblical pictures. But my book and some of the others are a very tiny attempt to show to Christians that they don't have to go along, even if the professor or the book or Time magazine or whatever says no, religion developed out of primitive beliefs, so-called. The Bible is right, and it doesn't need for us to justify it. But as Clark Pinnock used to say, the heart cannot rejoice in what the mind rejects as false.
Right.
And this is just one small part of that. We can, with our minds, accept what we also accept with our hearts and by faith.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Corduan, for those words. Definitely, I mean, the information that you have shared here, I think, those who have been watching this would definitely be blessed by it, and they can actually use this for the advancement of the kingdom. We really appreciate your time and for being with us through this conversation.
Thank you. It's been good for me. I enjoyed very much your questions and the opportunity to give them answers. And I appreciate the honor of being on your program.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Corduan.